Thank you very much for having me and for asking me to discuss this paper. It is commonplace in discussions like this to start by saying that this is a great paper. And here I really mean it. I think this is a wonderful paper. It belongs to any reading list on monetary policy design in Hank models, for sure. And my forecast is that it will be highly cited, maybe for the wrong reasons, but it will be highly cited. Okay, so very good. So in a sense, Alistair's presentation was a bit different from the paper, and I will stick to the logic of the paper, and then we'll see. But the first part of the paper, which Alistair didn't emphasize so much in today's presentation, is a description of what I call here the McKay-Wolf approach from a previous paper. And this approach, which I'm a big fan of, I think it's great, can be described as follows. The idea is to set up a policy problem as a linear quadratic optimal policy problem using a sequence-space representation of the equilibrium, those vectors that Alistair was referring to that describe the responses of variables to exogenous shocks. And then to complement that with a mapping from instruments, policy instruments, to targets, to the variables that appear in the welfare criterion. Okay? But that mapping is not based on a theoretical model. Instead, is based on empirical evidence. Okay? And it essentially contains impulse responses from policy instruments to the variables that enter the welfare criterion. If you have these ingredients, you can solve for optimal policy without actually having a model. It's incredibly ambitious because we think of models as rough approximations to the real world. So this tells us, look, you don't need a model. You just need to know what is the mapping, the empirical mapping from instruments to targets. And of course, you need a welfare criterion, which could be an ad hoc welfare criterion. It could be inspired by a model, and so on. Okay? So this paper, at least in the paper, is meant to be an application of this approach to the optimal monetary policy problem in a Hank environment. So that's extremely promising. Now, in the paper, they don't do this, which it was a bit disappointing to me. I think the paper is still very good, but I think it would have been great to hold to its promise and to apply the pure McKay-Wolf approach. They think they have the data and the tools to do it, but they didn't do it. I'm a bit. I'd like to ask Alistair, why didn't go all the way through in applying their own approach that they have been selling so well in a different paper? Very good. Now, let me put things a bit in context. This will be related to Alistair's presentation. And I think it's useful to have as a benchmark the rank model, the representative agent model. Okay, so this is taken from chapter 5, just cut and paste from chapter 5 in my textbook. So you have a central bank that minimizes this loss function subject to a new Keynesian Phillips curve, a dynamic IS equation. Pi is inflation, X is the gap between output and the efficient level of output, I is the nominal rate. I mean, all the variables, I think, the notation is self-explanatory. It's important to notice that the solution to this problem has a recursive structure. Okay, so using 1 and 2, you can solve for the optimal inflation output gap plan, and then you use 3 only to back out the interest rate rule that will implement that optimal plan. Okay, so this is important for Alistair's paper. Now, there are a number of key insights that come out of these analyses, like in response to efficient shocks that here are captured just by this efficient real interest rate. You want to fully stabilize output and inflation, so that's the divine coincidence result. That's optimal and possible. And you want to deviate from zero inflation and zero output gap only in response to cost push shocks. In that case, you want to accommodate partly the inflationary pressures from the cost push shock. And that calls for engineering a recession that is persistent, and actually any increase in inflation today you undo later, and effectively the price level reverts back to its original value. Okay, so those are the insights that emerge from the optimal policy problem in the rank model. And then the question is, well, how would the introduction of inequality affect some of those conclusions? No? Qualitatively or quantitatively, and there are three possible channels. There's no way around it. There are only three possible channels. Inequality may affect 1, it may affect 2, or it may affect 3, or obviously some combination of those. Okay? Now, in their paper, they, following much of the Hank literature, they make assumptions such that 2, the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, is not affected. Okay? And I think to a first, I think this is a reasonable strategy, at least to begin with. And as Alice there said, we may want to think further about ways in which household heterogeneity, not firm heterogeneity, may affect the inflation dynamics. Okay? So 2 will hold throughout. Okay? So then the question is, well, shall we change 1? Shall we change 3? Okay? Now, in the first framework, it's a dual mandate framework, what they do is to keep 1 unchanged. Okay? And the only thing that they allow for is a change in 3, the dynamic chaos equation, the mapping between interest rates and output gap. Okay? So obviously, if we keep 1 and 2 unchanged, and here's where I should say this is obvious, no? The outcome for inflation and the output gap is the same, is unchanged. Okay? But then, and then the question would be, well, but maybe the implementation, the introduction of inequality changes the implementation. But they make an argument which is very interesting, which say, look, it doesn't matter, because irrespective of whether there is inequality or not, you want the mapping from interest rates, say, to output gap and inflation to match the empirical evidence, okay? Independently of whether there is inequality or not, and whether inequality is important or not. So the conclusion is that to the extent that this mapping from interest rates to macro outcomes is quantitatively relevant, that is, it matches the empirical evidence, then the path of interest rates is unaffected by whether there is inequality or not. Okay, so that's what I call inequality irrelevance result. Now, my first comment is, well, suppose that we didn't have evidence or good evidence on that mapping, okay? And that we prefer to rely on the transmission implied by a model, okay? So I think it's legitimate. Now, inequality, from my reading of the literature, does not seem to affect much the mapping between interest rates and macro outcomes in typical Hank models. Okay, so the conclusion would not be that different. And Alice there today showed a figure that made this point. Here is a couple of figures. The first one taken from a paper of mine with Davide De Bortoli that shows just the response of aggregate output to an exogenous monetary policy shock in the rank model in blue and in a typical Hank model in red. So the difference is not is tiny. Okay, so the transmission, the introduction of inequality doesn't seem to affect the transmission much. This is from Danila Smirnov, who is a brilliant graduate student at UPF who's on the job market this year, and that illustrates the point in a slightly different way. So take the optimal policy in rank is the blue line, okay? So it's fully stabilized. So this is in response to a technology shock, okay? So you fully stabilize inflation, and output, declines in proportion to TFP so that the output gap is fully closed. And the real interest rate that supports that outcome is the one that you see in blue, okay? Now, so this is what we could call a strict inflation targeting, okay? Now take the Hank model, okay, which is very standard in his case, and then impose that policy in the Hank model. So it's not optimal. It turns out not to be optimal in his approach, but for strict inflation targeting, you see inflation is fully stabilized. And you can see that, well, output by constructions, since the New Keynesian-Phillips curve is not changed, it follows the same pattern, but notice that the real interest rate that supports that policy is very similar, okay? So the implementation doesn't seem to be affected by the introduction of inequality either. So from here, we would conclude, again, this inequality irrelevance result that I was mentioned earlier. But now let's look at the second case, second framework, which holds more of a promise in order to make inequality relevant. Okay, so that's the Ramsey policy, and the Ramsey policy, as Alice there explained very well, implies that, by the way, he didn't mention it, I think, in the presentation, this was not an ad hoc term that they included in the loss function. This is derived from first principles, okay? From an approximation, a second-order approximation to the utility of households. Okay, so there is this additional term that involves these deviations of consumption shares from the steady state. Okay, so that may affect the optimal policy to the extent that, in the absence of that consideration, the optimal policy response was one that would have implied large changes in the distribution of consumption. Okay. Now, so here, in principle, the optimal inflation and output gap outcome is different from rank, okay? But this will be the case only, and this, to me, this is in a sense, it's trivial, but it's a powerful insight. This will be the case only if the policy instrument affects the cross-sectional consumption inequality. If it doesn't affect inequality, then it doesn't matter how much weight the central bank puts on inequality. Okay, that will not affect policy. Okay, so one way to think about it is, many central banks seem to be very concerned about climate change, with good reason. Okay, however, the fact that they are very concerned about climate change, if monetary policy, hypothetically, were not to have any impact on climate change should not affect the design of monetary policy. So that's the key message. And so they calibrate the model based on evidence on the distributional effects of monetary policy shocks. And the model, it just happens to be such that monetary policy is distributionally neutral. Okay? So this condition is satisfied, and hence, optimal policy is not affected, or hardly affected, by the introduction of inequality. Okay, of course, when it comes to transfers, things are very different because transfers affect the cross-sectional distribution of consumption strongly, and they are much more powerful. Okay, so the division of labor is clear. Monetary policy should just focus on inflation and the output gap. Let fiscal authority take care of inequality. So some quick comments. Inequality irrelevance is not a general result. Okay? The monetary policy may not be distributionally neutral in other economies or in sample periods. It happens to be kind of neutral in their paper, but and even for the US, the evidence is not unambiguous. Okay? So in cases in which monetary policy is not distributionally neutral, it will have a role to play in addressing a distribution motive. And here are two examples, the Bandari et al. Paper that has been mentioned several times, and this paper by Smirnov, in which the optimal monetary policy actually is different, and quite different, from the one in the representative agent model, because their assumptions are such that it's not distributionally neutral. Now, can it beat transfers from a distributional point of view? It's not obvious, but still, a conditional analysis remains valid. Whatever transfer policy is in place, it's interesting to see what is the optimal policy. Now, in the inputs of the pure McKay-Wolf approach are a loss function and a policy impulse response functions. Now, there are practical problems with these. Available estimates of impulse response functions do not always yield robust results. Different people estimate different impulse response functions, and they may be distorted by endogenous response of some other policy instrument. Now, in practice, in this paper, the calibration of the Hank model is informed by evidence on distributional channels, not really by these impulse response functions of, say, policy instruments to consumption, which is what the pure McKay-Wolf approach would have called for. So model validation using evidence on cross-sectional response of consumption is done. And, well, this is, I mean, I won't get much into this. Alistair was very honest about this. It's not obvious that the match is a strong one, okay? In fact, it's not clear what one should look at. I mean, this is just the response of consumption on impact, okay, after a monetary policy shock for different wealth percentiles, okay? And there you see the response in the data after 2 years, after 4 years, but this is taken from the Holm et al. Paper. If you look at the response on impact, which is what, if anything, should be compared to the response on impact in their model, that's the line that you see that it's upward sloping, okay, which suggests that monetary policy would have some redistributive effects on impact. Okay? Just very quickly, because I'm out of time, just a couple of comments. The authors assume an efficient steady state, and the efficient steady state in their case requires a subsidy for the usual reasons to eliminate the monopolistic competition distortion, and the optimality of the steady state distribution of consumption. One question that I have for Alice there, I think it would be nice to relate this to the timeless perspective approach. That's what Danila Smirnov follows in his approach. And talking to him, we've reached a tentative conclusion that they may be actually equivalent or close to being equivalent. And of course, this would provide a theoretical justification for what you do, which now it seems a bit ad hoc. And finally, what I found missing in the paper was a discussion of the role of borrowing constraints and how they interact with policy in these Hank models. Borrowing constraints, usually binding borrowing constraints, play an important role, and how the changes in the fraction of constrained individuals interact with policy. I think this is something that is worth discussing. So final comments, great paper, tentative conclusion. Inequality considerations do not overturn the main insights from the ranked literature regarding how monetary policy should be conducted. I should be happy about this because that means that the conclusions from chapter 5 in my textbook remain valid. But I have to admit that this conclusion is not without challenge and that more work is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordi. We have some minutes for questions from the participants of this conference.
Hi, so great presentation and great discussion. So there's a little bit of an asymmetry in the paper in the way you treat the IS curve and the Phillips curve. And the IS curve is something that you argue one can basically take from aggregate data, whereas the Phillips curve is you just assume to be the same as the standard New Keynesian model's Phillips curve. But in principle, if one took your approach to the limit, one could also say, oh, we should just take the Phillips curve from the data. There's a lot of evidence that the Phillips curve from the data looks very different from the Phillips curve that you assume. For example, there's backward-looking term in inflation and so on. So I wonder how you think about this and whether one could extend your approach to thinking about taking a Phillips curve from the data.
Hi, yes. Jordi here from the bank. Very interesting, thank you for that. So 2 things. The first one, there is this paper by Meadman, Broer, and others that show the effects of monetary policy on separation rates. And there you see some kind of downward sloping incidence of monetary policy, which might be interesting for this analysis. And the other thing is that in the model, right, so you are using the balance sheet data and then use that to map to consumption behavior in the model, right? So I guess balance sheet is a one-to-one mapping to MPCs, right, in the model, because you're not estimating the responses directly, although you use this other paper. But my comment is that there is a lot of evidence on MPCs, and it's not super clear that it really depends on asset holdings the way you're assuming in this experiment. So maybe other types of structural heterogeneity that determines MPC might be relevant as well. Just
this paper and thanks, and also the discussion, very interesting. In these discussions, I always like to emphasize the life cycle aspects because I think they're very important to understanding the income and wealth distribution. If you think of the fiscal transfers that you got here, where you want a guest to transfer from the high end of the wealth distribution to the low end, or maybe the high end of the income distribution to the low end, these are people that are at different points in the life cycle, so you'd be distorting the whole economy and changing the interest rate around. And so in particular, the ones in the high end of the wealth distribution are going to be older, and those in the low end of the wealth distribution are going to be younger, so you'd be transferring between these agents, but it's not clear that you can hold the interest rate constant if you're going to do that.
Okay, so great presentation and great discussion as well. I want to make very, very quickly, I promise, 5 points. What I promise very, very quick. Okay, so first I want to kind of reemphasize this idea that I think Jordi explained very well, but just want to restate it because I think it's important, that essentially this inequality irrelevance that how Jordi sort of labeled it, it's a quantitative. It's because you sort of you calibrate the economy and you're at a particular point in the parameter space where that happens that these effects can offset each other, but it doesn't have to be that way. And as Jordi said, other economies, other points in time, things will look different. So yeah, fine. The second one, I would like to know what you think about why you find different results from Bandari et al. 3, there is one component of these models that is missing in your paper, but it's prominent in other models, which is counter-cyclical income risk, and the fact that so the way it varies across the distribution could also matter. Doesn't have to be just one number, but it could be a function also of the particular income level or earnings level at which you are in the distribution, and that can, I think, can affect the design of optimal monetary policy with a global solution. Finally, again, very quickly, I mean, I think it's great that you went through this in a great detail through all these assets of household balance sheets. There is one, though, that is extremely relevant for discount appraisal value of income and consumption of individuals, which is human capital. There is evidence that shows that aggregate shocks have a persistent effect on human capital, and these effects varies across the distribution. So I'm saying this because the paper that Felipe is presenting tomorrow has this flavor. And I think that is another dimension on which there could be effects that are unequal. And this is not the return on human capital. It's like the stock itself of human capital that could be affected differently across the distribution. Finally, I'm curious to know, it seems like you have a lot of capital, a lot of wealth in this economy. So what is the MPC, the aggregate MPC? Because that also determines to some extent the transmission mechanism of shocks. Thanks.
All right, great presentation. So I have 3 quick points. First, I really like your result that the new term in the welfare function can be just a deviation from steady-state shares. I think it's super interesting. I would love to see more of a discussion of what are the assumptions under which this is true and how general. I think, Jordi, pointed out having an optimal redistribution in steady-state versus timeless. I think also that boils down to you not caring where consumption come from. Is it from wages versus employment? You don't have a differential cost for having people work too much or something. So I think it'd be great to clarify that. Second point, I want to echo everyone in saying I love the approach of estimating impulse responses and using them, to compute the effect of policy. But I also think it'd be great to have some discussion of when would a kind of look as critique apply, and what are conditions when we could expect those impulse responses to be time varying. And finally, just on a connection between what you do and like a more like a richer model of the Phillips curve side, which of course is the horse that I have in the race. I would think that like the way I see your approach is saying I care about one specific source of inequality related with monetary policy, which is people's asset positions. And so I think your discussion is tailored and focused on that aspect. I think this is a very fair perspective. I just think maybe you could somehow make more explicit what are the assumptions that allow you to discuss this aspect like separate from the other aspect, which is what I consider it is more like the production side Phillips curve aspect.
Next.
Thanks. There are tons of questions in my mind right now, so I'm just going to say that I want to second all of the questions that have been done. I think that the exercise is a beautiful exercise to provide a benchmark. It's a very useful benchmark, and we need to understand better what conditions make a deviate from that benchmark. That said, I want to raise one point that is a little bit different, is about stability. So we saw that the implementation of interest rate in equilibrium is about the same if you ignore this distribution component. But there is a big discussion, too, about the conditions in which we can get into some spiral, instability spirals, stuff like that, of inflation. For instance, whether the Taylor principle still applies, whether lessons on that front still apply, and I'd like to hear your thought about it.
Thank you. Very nice paper, a great discussion. Two quick points. If you can elaborate Pareto weights, because the discussion I think went a bit fast there. I think almost from a philosophical point of view, it's hard to deviate from uniform Pareto weights. So unless there's a mandate, right? So how to think about that, and how does the Ramsey planner look like if you were to impose these uniform Pareto weights? And the second one is on implementation. If we were to take Jordi's great point that this irrelevance might not hold, and you were to implement Ramsey, would that fall more on the fiscal side or on the monetary policy side? Thanks.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry.
I'm going to be really brief. I was just curious, Alistair, so first of all, great presentation and discussion, but I was just curious if you had tried putting an investment, because one thing we have found in our work is that actually that breaks some kind of inequality irrelevance, in the sense that it generates, for example, differential aggregate responses to monetary policy in Hank versus Rank, and it actually loads more heavily on the indirect effects, on the hand-to-mouth folks. And so there, actually, you might get more of a tilt in the consumption share response to monetary policy. Thank you.
Okay, Alicia.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
So thanks for all the questions, and thank you, Jordi, for the great discussion. So I have 4.5 minutes to cover a lot of questions. So Jordi asked, why didn't he said, we set up this approach where we could use this empirical evidence directly, why didn't we follow through on that? And I would have loved to do that, and I think for some questions, you maybe could go all the way just with empirical evidence, but getting, the whole impulse response of the consumption shares for different types, that's how that responds to monetary policy at different horizons, that's a very complicated object to measure directly. So the way I think there's a little bit of a continuum of, we have that purely empirical approach, and then we have like the full model-based approach that we're doing today, but there's something in between where you can use that sort of logic of the impulse response functions to motivate what types of data you should be looking at, and that's sort of the direction I was trying to go in today. But you could also use sort of a model to fill in for the data that you're missing. So you could use some of those theta matrices, estimate them directly, and say, for this other theta, I need to impose some structure on it, structure that could come from a structural model, and then estimate that theta from a model. So I think there is a little bit of a hybrid approach that one could potentially try to pursue, but this is like a ongoing desire to kind of flesh out that implementation of that approach. Jordi asked about the role of borrowing constraints. And I think when I was thinking about that question, I was thinking, yeah, there is going to be a logic where monetary policy could potentially relax or tighten borrowing constraints, and that would have implications. And that would be going on in the model, and it would manifest through this consumption distribution. So at the end of the day, what the loss function is capturing is, can people more or less effectively smooth their consumption? And so it was sort of behind the scenes, I think. Okay, so yeah, so I'm just going to cover some things where I feel like I have, can clarify some things, and if I don't cover your question, please see me. Okay, so there was a question from the back about what was the role of the balance sheets and balance sheet data and how that related to MPC. So I just wanted to clarify what we were doing there. We're really using that balance sheet data to understand how people are differentially exposed to different asset prices, but then the MPCs are really coming from the model. So Gianluca had a series of questions. So, so how does this contrast with the Banderi et al. Results? So, there's difference in their methods, in their objective function, but there's differences in their model, and I can speak more directly to those differences. And so in their model, this labor share issue is kind of behaving rather differently from the way it does in our model. So if you think of a cost push shock in the very standard sticky price model, that's gonna drive markups up, drive the labor share down. And then monetary policy is very well suited to undo that change in markups. So the firm owners want to charge higher markups, and then the central bank comes and stimulates the economy to drive the markups back down. And so that when markups have this strong distributional implication, you can actually, monetary policy is very well suited to address that issue in that model. We made this different assumption about how monopoly profits are distributed, which kind of short circuits that logic. Okay, so Gianluca asked about the aggregate MPC. So our model does a good job of matching like the top end of the wealth distribution. It's not so great on the bottom end, and a bunch of people are piled up at the constraint. So we get a high MPC, 15, 20%, but it's coming from like a counterfactual massing of people at the constraint. Okay, let's see. Okay, Andres asked about, elaborate on the Pareto weights. So this is not like coming from like a philosopher point of view. This is coming from, A, what do we need to assume to make this work? B, we think it's reasonable. So I think that it may be more reasonable. It may be reasonable for a central bank to say, we're going to think about how we respond to the cycle, and we recognize that affects different types of households differently, but we're not going to think about long-run redistribution issues. And so the social welfare function that we write down incorporates concerns about distributional effects on consumption, on the consumption distribution, but by construction, it eliminates any desire to change the steady state distribution. So I guess thank you very much.